Today I will tell you about a man whose name is known throughout the world today, though it is most often associated with a luxury electric car. Yet, the real Nikola Tesla was a far more fascinating figure than any automobile. In the late 19th century and the first half of the 20th, the name Tesla never left the front pages of newspapers around the world. People wrote of a brilliant Serbian scholar who could harness electricity like the mythical Prometheus tamed fire. They said competitors tried to kill him. It was whispered that, in the end, Nazi spies succeeded. American FBI agents and Soviet intelligence services pursued his inventions. He collaborated with the wealthiest men in America and Europe, financiers whose names remain synonymous with great fortunes to this day: Morgan, Rothschild, Vanderbilt. His ideas were decades ahead of their time, sometimes by more than 100 years. The problem was that his contemporaries often could not understand or believe in them. The story of Nikola Tesla begins in a place that is difficult to find, even on a detailed map today. High in the mountains, near the Adriatic coast, lies a small village called Smiljan. It belongs to Croatia today, but in the mid-19th century, it was part of the border province of Leka, within the vast Austrian Empire, which was soon to transform into the Austro-Hungarian monarchy. It was a harsh and wild land where life moved to the rhythm set by the seasons, and modernity arrived with years of delay. On the night of July 9–10, 1856, a powerful storm raged over Smiljan. Lightning tore the sky apart, thunder echoed off mountain peaks, and torrential rain turned village roads into rushing streams. In one of the houses, amid that elemental chaos, a boy was coming into the world. According to the family legend that Tesla liked to recount later, the midwife reportedly said that a child born during such a storm would be a child of quote, darkness. The mother in labor answered firmly, no, he would be a child of light. Difficult to imagine more prophetic words for a man who would dedicate his entire life to harnessing electricity. The boy was named Nikola. His father, Milutin Tesla, was an Orthodox clergyman, an educated and widely read man by the standards of a provincial village. He served as the vicar of the local parish and was respected by the surrounding community. His mother, Duka, née Mendik, came from a family in which the clergy was a tradition passed down from generation to generation. Her father was also an Orthodox priest, as were many of her other male ancestors. Duka herself could neither write nor read, which in those times and in that environment was nothing unusual for a woman. Yet she possessed something far more precious than formal education. Nikola's mother had a phenomenal memory that filled all who knew her with admiration. She could recite from memory long passages of Serbian folk epics, entire songs and poems transmitted orally from generation to generation. She knew extensive portions of the Bible by heart and could summon them at the right moments with unfailing precision. That ability to retain and process information without the aid of writing was a form of intelligence that, in later generations, was to manifest in an entirely different, revolutionary way. Duka Tesla also possessed another extraordinary quality that set her apart from other village women. She had an innate talent for devising practical improvements in household management. She constantly constructed various devices to make daily work easier. She built a mechanical beater for whipping eggs, improved the spinning wheel, and invented a number of enhancements for the stove and the weaving loom. When asked where she got these ideas, she would simply answer that she did not know, that they came to her on their own. This practical, intuitive genius for invention was to bloom fully only in her son. Nikola was the fourth of 5 children born to Milutin and Duka. He had an older brother, Dane, and 3 sisters, Milka, Angelina, and Marika. From his earliest years, he stood out among his siblings for extraordinary curiosity about the world and a certain introversion. He was a child who could spend hours watching ants travel along a path or following the movement of clouds across the sky. At the same time, he showed a remarkable determination to acquire knowledge. He started school before he had even turned 5, so great was his desire to learn something new. Little Nikola watched his mother at work with fascination. He observed how her nimble fingers operated the complicated mechanisms she had invented herself. He watched how she solved practical problems that other women in the village could not manage. These observations shaped his mind in ways no one could then foresee. Many years later, already an acclaimed inventor, Tesla wrote in his memoirs that he had inherited from his father a thirst for knowledge, and from his mother liveliness of mind and the capacity to create. That combination of intellectual curiosity with a practical talent for invention was to shape one of the most original minds in the history of humanity. Even as a small boy, Nikola began to show a tendency for independent experimentation. Local boys used hollow reeds as blowpipes to shoot small stones. Nikola analyzed the construction of this simple weapon and decided to improve it. He added a kind of piston that increased the force of the shot and proposed using raw hemp instead of stones, which could be formed into perfect projectiles. He then traded his improved blowpipes with older boys for various useful things. This was the first, still childlike expression of a talent that would later change the face of civilization. On another occasion, Nikola watched birds soaring over the village. Their flight seemed so simple and natural to him that the boy concluded a human being ought to be able to fly as well, given the right means. He took an umbrella, climbed onto the barn roof, and jumped. The fall was not dangerous, but painful enough to keep the young experimenter in bed for the next few weeks. The incident did not discourage him from further attempts to understand and overcome the laws of nature. On the contrary, it taught him that between an idea and its realization lies a long road of research and preparation. One day there occurred an episode that perfectly illustrates the character of the young Tesla. He was accidentally locked in a barn and forgotten. Any other child would have shouted and pounded on the door calling for help. Nikola, however, spent the entire night there in silence, absorbed in his own thoughts. His parents searched for him all over the neighborhood, asked neighbors, combed the nearby meadows and woods. When the barn door was finally opened the next day, the boy walked out calmly, as if nothing had happened. This early manifestation of an ability to concentrate deeply and shut out the external world was to become one of the most characteristic traits of the adult inventor. Smiljan and its surroundings constituted an environment that at first glance seemed ill-suited to the development of a future genius of technology. There were no laboratories, scientific libraries, or universities. Electricity remained something abstract, known only from stories about distant cities, or from lightning illuminating the sky during storms. And yet it was in that simple rural setting that the foundations of a mind destined to revolutionize humanity's use of energy were formed. Closeness to nature, observation of its phenomena, the simplicity of life that forced practical solutions to problems, and finally, the genetic inheritance of inventiveness from his mother. All of this combined into a unique set of conditions shaping young Nikola. The village of Smiljan lay within the military frontier, a specific zone of the Austrian Empire, inhabited mainly by Orthodox Serbs. For centuries the region had served as a buffer, protecting the Habsburg monarchy from the Ottoman Empire. Its inhabitants enjoyed certain privileges in exchange for readiness for military service. This military tradition, combined with the harsh mountain climate and tough conditions of life, shaped people who were resilient, enduring, and determined. These qualities would prove invaluable in Nikola Tesla's later life, when he repeatedly had to face adversities that would have broken a man of weaker character. Life in Smiljan moved to the rhythm set by the Orthodox calendar and the cycle of agricultural work. Nikola's father, as the local priest, occupied a special position in this community. The Tesla household was a place where people came seeking advice, comfort, or simply conversation with an educated man. Young Nikola therefore grew up in an atmosphere where the written and spoken word held particular value, where knowledge and wisdom were prized. His father's library, though modest by urban standards, was an inexhaustible source of fascination for the boy. The Austrian Empire in the mid-19th century was undergoing a period of profound change. The Industrial Revolution, which had been transforming England and Western Europe for decades, was beginning to reach the central part of the continent. Railways connected more and more cities, factories sprang up like mushrooms after rain, and a new force, electricity, was beginning to captivate scholars and inventors. Of all these changes in distant Smiljan, little was known, and what was known arrived mainly through delayed newspapers and the stories of travelers. Yet even these fragments of information about the New World fired the imagination of the sensitive boy, who stared at lightning in the night and wondered what this mysterious force falling from the sky actually was. Nikola's childhood was brutally interrupted by a tragedy that forever changed the fate of the whole family. His older brother Dane, the firstborn son of Milutin and Duka, was killed in an accident at the age of only 12. He fell from a horse and broke his neck. Death was instantaneous. For his parents it was a blow from which they never fully recovered. Dane had been regarded as an exceptionally talented child, the true pride of the family. His father had placed great hopes in him, seeing in his firstborn son the continuation of the family tradition of the clergy, perhaps even someone who would rise higher in the church hierarchy than he himself had. Nikola was barely 6 years old when his brother died. In his later memoirs, he wrote that this trauma left a lasting mark on him. Moreover, Dane's death completely changed the way his parents looked at their younger son. Until that point, Nikola had remained somewhat in the shadow of his older brother, treated as one of the children, not particularly distinguished. Now, however, with Dane gone, all the hopes and expectations his father had attached to his firstborn transferred automatically to Nikola. And those expectations were clear and not open to discussion. Nikola was to become an Orthodox clergyman, as his father, grandfathers, and great-grandfathers had been before him. For a boy with so lively a mind and such broad interests, the prospect of confining himself to the framework of a clerical career must have been overwhelming. Nikola respected his father and understood the weight of family tradition, but his heart drew him in entirely different directions. He was fascinated by machines, mechanisms, forces of nature. He wanted to understand how the world worked, not merely in a spiritual sense, but above all in a material, physical sense. These inner conflicts were to accompany him throughout his youth, until the illness and death of his father finally opened the path to his own choices. A year after Dane's death, the Tesla family moved to Gospic, a larger town in the same province, Lika. Nikola's father received a parish post there, which meant a promotion and better living conditions. For the 7-year-old boy, the move represented a great change. Gospic, though by today's standards a small town, seemed a true metropolis compared to the village of Smiljan. There were shops, offices, more people in the streets, more stimulation for a curious mind. Nikola helped his father with services, but religious ceremonies bored him enormously. Far more to his taste was the role of bell ringer, which was eventually entrusted to him. Climbing the tower, operating the bell mechanism, watching the town from above gave him a sense of freedom and detachment from the monotony of the liturgy. Unfortunately, one day this pleasure ended in scandal. Running down the stairs of the bell tower, right after the service ended, Nikola collided with an elegantly dressed woman from the local aristocracy and stepped on the train of her gown. The woman raised a terrible cry, accusing the boy of ruining her costly dress. The incident, trivial as it was, left in Tesla's memory a lasting aversion to women who wore pearls and large earrings, which that lady happened to have. In Gospic, Nikola completed primary school, and at the age of 10 began attending what was called a real gymnasium. It was there that his extraordinary mathematical talent revealed itself in full. The boy could solve complicated equations in his head, without using a blackboard or paper. At first his teachers could not believe it was possible. They suspected him of cheating, of hiding crib sheets, of some unknown trick. Only repeated tests, conducted under strict supervision, convinced them that they were dealing with an exceptional mind. Mathematical ability went hand in hand with other talents, but also with certain limitations. Nikola was left-handed, which in a 19th-century school was treated as a defect requiring correction. In time, he learned to use both hands almost equally well, which was to serve him in his later laboratory work. He had no talent whatsoever for drawing and any activity requiring artistic skill. His genius was abstract, mathematical, visionary, not artistic in the traditional sense. There were no manual arts classes at school that could have satisfied his need for tinkering. Nikola managed on his own. He taught himself woodworking and metalworking, using methods he partly invented himself and partly observed from local craftsmen. This ability to combine theory with practice, abstract thinking, with concrete physical work, was to become one of the foundations of his later career as an inventor. During this period, the characteristic daily rhythm of Tesla's life also took shape. During the day he studied, explored the surroundings, and experimented with various materials and mechanisms. At night, he devoured books from his father's library. He read everything that came to hand: fiction, scientific works, travel accounts, philosophical treatises. His parents worried about this nocturnal habit and feared for their son's health. They tried to forbid it and hid the candles. Nikola, however, always found a way. He stopped up the gaps under the door so light would not seep into the corridor, and made candles himself from tallow. Even then, he needed only 2 or 3 hours of sleep a day to function. This characteristic remained with him for the rest of his life. In 1870, at 14, Nikola completed the Real Gymnasium in Gospic as one of its best students. The road to further education lay open before him, but it was precisely then that serious health problems appeared. No one could determine exactly what was wrong with him. Doctors threw up their hands, finding no specific disease. The most probable cause was extreme nervous exhaustion, combined with a rapid growth spurt. Nikola was growing exceptionally fast, eventually reaching nearly 2 meters in height, a great rarity in those times, and one that must have placed an enormous strain on his body. Despite feeling unwell, Nikola did not stop reading. He read in bed, consuming volume after volume, with growing feverishness. His parents watched with concern, but could not stop him. Books were his only window on the world, while illness kept him bedridden. He then enrolled at the higher Real Gymnasium in Karlovac, a city some tens of kilometers from home. He completed the 4-year program in only 3 years, which testified to his undiminished intellectual abilities despite his physical problems. In Karlovac, he was particularly captivated by lectures in physics and the accompanying laboratory demonstrations. The sight of electric sparks, the operation of simple electrostatic machines, experiments with magnetism, all of this put him into a state close to ecstasy. It was there, watching those demonstrations, that Nikola realized what he wanted to devote his life to. Not a clerical career, as his father wished, but to the study of electricity. That mysterious force which flashed in laboratories and fell from the sky in storms became his obsession. After finishing secondary school in Karlovac, Nikola returned to Gospic. He had a short holiday ahead of him, and then 3 years of compulsory military service, which was universal in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Then, according to his father's wishes, a clerical career awaited him. Nikola came to his hometown to rest before what was to come. Meanwhile, a cholera epidemic was raging in Gospic. The body of the young man, weakened by years of intensive study and health problems, had no chance against the disease. Nikola was infected almost immediately upon arrival. For 9 long months he lay in hospital, hovering between life and death. Doctors lost hope repeatedly. His body wasted to the extreme, fever unrelenting for weeks, attacks of weakness that deprived him of consciousness. Nikola looked at his future and saw nothing in it worth fighting for. Military service, then a theological seminary, then a provincial parish somewhere in the mountains. That prospect gave him no strength to fight the illness. And then a turning point came that changed everything. According to Tesla's own account, already almost on the threshold of death, he summoned his father to his bedside. When Milutin leaned over the bed, Nikola told him he might recover if his father allowed him to study what truly interested him. If he freed him from the compulsion of a clerical career and let him devote himself to the science of electricity, the father, seeing his son on what appeared to be his deathbed, agreed without hesitation. He promised to send him to the best technical institution that could be found. Nikola Tesla got up from his bed a week and a half later. Doctors could not explain the sudden improvement. Of course, the cholera did not disappear in a day, and the return to full health took considerably longer. The illness also left lasting marks on his health that would make themselves felt throughout his later life. Nevertheless, the will to live itself, recovered thanks to his father's promise, proved a more powerful force than all the medicines. Nikola now had a goal worth surviving for. There remained, however, the problem of military service, which could destroy these plans. A young man who had survived cholera was not in a condition to undergo 3 years of military training. His parents therefore decided to hide their son from conscription. They sent him into the Croatian mountains, where for 8 months he was to regain his strength, far from military commissions and officials. Nikola took with him only a bundle of books and hunting equipment. For the next few months he wandered alone through forests and by lakes, breathing mountain air and thinking about the future. Solitude in the mountains turned out to be a remarkable time for Nikola. Far from people, duties, and expectations, he could finally freely give himself over to thoughts that had been swirling in his head for years. Wandering forest paths, climbing rocky peaks, sitting on the banks of crystal-clear lakes, he spun visions that would have seemed pure madness to most people. He imagined a pipe running along the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean, connecting Europe with America. Through this pipe, using the principle of hydraulic pressure, letters and parcels could be transmitted at a speed no ship could achieve. He also thought about a gigantic ring encircling the Earth along the equator, which would serve as a global transportation network. These ideas, though they may seem like fantasy today, testified to a mind that knew no boundaries in designing the future. 8 months passed more quickly than anyone could have expected. Nikola returned home, transformed. The mountain air and quiet had done their work. His body had regained its strength, and his mind had acquired a new clarity. His father kept the promise he had made at his sick son's bedside. In the autumn of 1875, Nikola Tesla set off for Graz, a city in Austrian Styria, where the famous higher technical school was located. In his later memoirs, he wrote that although he was born in 1856, he considered 1875 the true beginning of his life, the year he crossed the threshold of the institution in Graz. The Polytechnic in Graz was one of the best technical universities in the entire Austro-Hungarian Empire. Outstanding professors lectured there. The laboratories were equipped with modern, for those times, apparatus, and the curriculum covered all branches of contemporary technology. For a young man who throughout his previous life had been forced to satisfy his hunger for knowledge with provincial schools and his father's home library, this was a true paradise. Nikola threw himself into study with a zeal that quickly began to alarm those around him. From his first days at the institution, Tesla worked like one possessed. He rose at 3 in the morning and studied until 11 at night. He attended every lecture he could fit into his schedule, even those not directly related to his field. He read everything that came to hand, solved problems far beyond the curriculum. Professors were at first delighted by such a diligent student, but in time, their delight gave way to concern. The dean of the institution even wrote a letter to Nikola's father, warning that his son was working too intensively and was at risk of a nervous breakdown or something worse. Milutin Tesla tried to intervene, but his son ignored all advice. Such intensive work was bound to affect his relations with his peers. Other students could not understand why anyone would torment himself so, when it was quite unnecessary. Nikola did not go with them to coffee houses, took no part in student entertainments, had no interest in girls. His world consisted of books, lectures, and laboratories. This social isolation quickly turned into hostility on the part of his classmates. Typical academic bullying began. Someone would mess up his bedding, knowing how greatly Nikola valued order and cleanliness. Someone else would let a cat into his room to demolish everything in its path. Still others poured ink over his notes, destroying the results of many hours of work. Nikola bore all of this in silence for as long as he could. In the end, however, his patience ran out. At nearly 2 meters tall, he was physically much stronger than most of his tormentors. When he began to defend himself, the bullying stopped, but an atmosphere of isolation remained, accompanying him throughout his studies in Graz. The only true friend he made during this time was a young man named Antal Szigeti. He came from Hungary and was the only person who never participated in tormenting Nikola. On the contrary, from the start he treated him with sympathy and respect. This friendship, formed within the walls of the Polytechnic in Graz, was to last for decades and play a key role in the lives of both men. The problems with classmates were nothing compared to the conflict that broke out between Tesla and one of the professors. Jakub Poślj was a respected physicist, a lecturer who enjoyed enormous authority at the university. During one of his lectures, he demonstrated the operation of a direct current machine, a so-called dynamo. Tesla, listening to the professor's explanation, concluded that this design had serious flaws and could be significantly improved by eliminating the sparking commutators. He raised his hand and shared his thoughts with the professor and the entire room. Poślj reacted with evident irritation. He explained to the student that his ideas were theoretically impossible to realize, that direct current was the only practical form of electric current, and that dreams of alternating current motors were the fantasies of an ignoramus. Nikola did not yield. The discussion dragged on, and Tesla managed to refute the professor's arguments twice, a public humiliation for the experienced lecturer. Poślj did not forget the slight. From that point on, he used every opportunity to make life difficult for the impertinent student. The pressure from the professor, isolation from classmates, and above all, the inhuman pace of work began to take their toll. In his third year of study, Nikola stood on the brink of breakdown, and then made a decision that in retrospect seems surprising, but which at the time may have been a desperate attempt to escape his problems. He decided to become like the others. He started going to beer halls, playing billiards, and above all, playing cards. And it was cards that became his undoing. Gambling gripped Nikola with a force he could not resist. The same mind that could solve complicated equations in his head now calculated probabilities in card games. He won often, but lost even more often. Debts grew week by week. It came to the point that his mother had to pay off his final gambling debt, sending money from the family savings. In December 1878, Tesla was expelled from the institution in Graz. He had not passed his final examinations, and his financial situation was catastrophic. After being dismissed from the Polytechnic, Nikola moved to Maribor, a Slovenian city belonging to Austro-Hungary at the time. He found work there as an engineering assistant, but the gambling habit never left him for a moment. He continued to play, continued to lose. The following spring, he lost his job and ended up in the street. The story of his fall reached its lowest point when the police arrested him as a vagrant, without means of support, and sent him home to Gospic with a report describing him as a drunkard and a rogue. For the son of an Orthodox priest, for a former star student at the Polytechnic, it was a moment of absolute humiliation. Back in the family home, Nikola found his father gravely ill. Milutin Tesla lay in bed, wasted by an illness his doctors could not halt. A difficult conversation took place between father and son. Nikola confessed everything: the gambling, the debts, the expulsion from the university, the misery of the preceding months. The father listened in silence. When his son had finished, the old priest did not pronounce words of condemnation. Instead, he told Nikola that he believed in him, that despite everything that had happened, he saw in him the potential for great things. And he asked one thing of him: that he go to Prague and continue his studies at the university there. In April 1879, Milutin Tesla died. Nikola, though plunged in grief and guilt, resolved to fulfill his father's last wish. At the beginning of the following year, he set off for Prague, where the famous Charles University was located, the oldest institution in Central Europe, founded in the 14th century. However, fulfilling his father's wish proved more difficult than anyone could have foreseen. The problem was that Tesla did not know Greek. At 19th-century European universities, knowledge of the classical languages, Latin and Greek, was a fundamental requirement. Nikola was fluent in many modern languages, speaking German, English, and French, but had never learned Greek. For this reason, he could not be admitted as a regular student. He was allowed only to attend lectures as an informal auditor. This meant he received no official grades and could not borrow books from the university library. That last obstacle proved the most painful. The Library of Charles University was famous for its vast collections, accumulated over more than 5 centuries of the institution's existence. For someone as hungry for knowledge as Nikola, the inability to use these collections was a true torment. He could read books only on the premises, in the reading room, which he tried to do for many hours a day. The problem was that the old library had appalling hygienic conditions. The dust on the shelves and books seemed not to have been disturbed since the university's founding in the 14th century. Nikola, who had always been exceptionally sensitive to dirt and disorder, read with a handkerchief pressed to his nose. Other students looked at him strangely. Some joked behind his back that he probably had syphilis. His stay in Prague did not last long. The conditions were too difficult, the possibilities for study too limited, and money from the family savings was running out at an alarming rate. Nikola knew he had to find another solution. It was then that fate extended a helping hand in the form of an uncle on his mother's side. Pázsa Mándok was a wealthy and influential man who had risen to the rank of colonel in the Austro-Hungarian army and had settled in Budapest. His uncle offered his nephew work on the construction of a modern telephone exchange in the Hungarian capital. For a young man who dreamed of working with electricity, it was an offer not to be refused. Budapest in 1881 was a city in full bloom. The capital of the Hungarian part of the Habsburg monarchy was experiencing a period of rapid development, matching Vienna in its pace of modernization, and in some respects even surpassing it. New boulevards cut through former neighborhoods, imposing apartment buildings rose up, and monumental public buildings were going up along the Danube. It was here, in this vibrant city, that Nikola Tesla was to begin a new chapter of his life. Uncle Pázsa Mándok kept his word. Through his connections, Nikola received a position at the company building the first Hungarian telephone exchange. This undertaking was part of the global expansion of American telecommunications technology. The company implementing the project worked in close cooperation with the American giant that would later become known as American Telephone and Telegraph. For a young engineer without a formal diploma, it was a unique opportunity to work with the most advanced technology of the time. In Budapest, another surprise awaited Nikola. It turned out that his old friend from his days in Graz, Antal Szigeti, lived there. The Hungarian welcomed his former colleague enthusiastically and immediately offered help. Thanks to him, Tesla found a small 2-room flat in a respectable district, which he could pay for on a junior engineer's salary. After years of wandering, humiliation, and uncertainty, Nikola finally had steady work, a roof over his head, and a friend he could count on. Work on the construction of the telephone exchange proved less demanding than Tesla had expected. His duties as an electromechanical engineer did not absorb him fully, which at first seemed a disadvantage of the post. In time, however, Nikola understood that this situation had its advantages. The free time he had in abundance, he could devote to his own thoughts and projects. A mind that for years had been occupied with the struggle for survival could at last freely work on problems that had fascinated him since his first physics lectures in Karlovac. His career at the Budapest telephone firm advanced surprisingly quickly. Tesla showed not only technical competence, but also an ability to solve problems that had brought more experienced colleagues to a standstill. He quickly rose to the position of chief electromechanical engineer, a remarkable achievement for someone who had not formally completed any technical institution. It was in Budapest, according to his own memoirs, that he created his first true invention, a telephone amplifier. The device was never described or patented, but word of it spread through engineering circles widely enough that people began visiting Tesla with proposals for collaboration. One such visitor was the German physicist Georg Quincke, the brother of the famous physician. Quincke came specially from Germany to meet the young engineer and to offer him a position in his prestigious workshop. For many, this would have been an irresistible offer. Tesla, however, declined. Quincke was above all a theoretician, and Nikola was interested in practice. He wanted to build machines that would work, not write treatises on how they might theoretically work. This decision, made in a Budapest flat, was to shape the entire subsequent course of the inventor's professional career. Yet the true significance of the stay in Budapest was connected neither with work at the telephone firm nor with the German professor's visit. The most important event of those years had an almost mystical character and unfolded during an ordinary evening walk in the park. It was February 1882. Nikola was strolling with Antal Szigeti through one of Budapest's parks, watching the sunset over the Danube. As he often did in his friend's company, he was reciting from memory passages from favorite literary works. That evening he had chosen Goethe's Faust, a drama that had fascinated him for years. He was declaiming a passage describing the setting sun, when suddenly, in the middle of a line, he froze. Antal watched with amazement as his friend's face changed, as his eyes fixed on some point in space inaccessible to others. Tesla stood like that for a long moment, entirely cut off from the surrounding world. Then, without a word of explanation, he picked up a branch lying on the path and began drawing a complicated diagram in the sand. What took shape on the sandy path of the Budapest park was the design of an induction motor powered by alternating current. In a single moment, in a flash of illumination, Tesla saw the solution to a problem on which the best engineers of the age had been working without success: a rotating magnetic field that allowed the creation of a motor without sparking commutators, without mechanical friction, without all the defects of direct current machines. The vision was so vivid, so complete, that Nikola could draw every detail, every element of the construction, as if looking at a finished machine. Antal Szigeti did not fully understand the significance of what he had just witnessed. He knew, however, that he was witnessing something extraordinary. In the weeks that followed, Tesla talked to him about his vision for hours, explaining the operating principles of the motor, drawing further diagrams, making plans for the future. That same diagram, sketched with a stick in the sand, was 6 years later to be presented before the most prestigious assembly of engineers in America, and change the face of industrial civilization. Budapest gave Tesla the time and calm needed for this breakthrough discovery. However, the Hungarian capital could not offer him the means to realize his vision. Building prototypes required resources that no company in Austro-Hungary possessed. Tesla knew he had to look for opportunities elsewhere. The chance came when his employer at the Budapest telephone firm wrote him a letter of recommendation for work at the European branch of what was then the most powerful electrical empire in the world, the company of Thomas Alva Edison. Edison was for Tesla, as for millions of people throughout the world, an almost mythical figure. The American inventor who, without formal education, had built an industrial empire was a symbol of the new age. His invention, the carbon filament light bulb, had illuminated streets and homes on both sides of the Atlantic. His name was associated with progress, modernity, the future. The possibility of working for Edison's firm, even in a European branch, was for the young engineer the fulfillment of a dream. In the spring of 1882, Tesla bade farewell to Budapest and set out for Paris. Edison's Continental Company was based in the French capital, and from there managed all the American magnate's European interests. For someone who only recently had lived as a vagabond being sent home with a police report, this was an almost unimaginable rise. Nikola was heading for the center of European civilization, to the City of Light, to the firm belonging to his idol. Paris turned out, however, to be a much more difficult place to live than Budapest. Rents exceeded anything Tesla had known from his previous places of residence. The salary of a junior engineer, though decent, was not enough for a comfortable life in the very heart of the city. Nikola had to make do with a cramped room rented from an aging landlady in the working-class district of Saint-Marcel. It was a striking contrast. On the one hand, work for the most powerful electrical company in the world. On the other, wretched lodgings in the poor part of the city. Despite these difficulties, Tesla quickly acclimatized to his new environment. He began his mornings with a swim in the Seine, which was still possible and popular among Parisians at the time. Then he went to work, where his talents were quickly noticed. Edison's company assigned him increasingly responsible tasks, sending him to various cities in France to install or repair lighting systems. Tesla used this situation to bring his Hungarian friend to Paris. He wrote a letter of recommendation for Antal Szigeti, thanks to which he too received a position at Edison's firm. In September 1883, something occurred that could have become a turning point in the young engineer's career. In Strasbourg, a city then belonging to Germany, a new railway station was being opened. The ceremony was of state character. The Emperor Wilhelm I himself was present. Edison's firm had supplied the electric lighting system, which was to be the pride of modern Germany. Meanwhile, during the opening ceremony, catastrophe struck. A short circuit occurred at the station's substation. A fire broke out, part of a wall collapsed. All of this happened before the Emperor's eyes. The scandal was enormous. Edison's firm's reputation in Europe was called into question. The damage had to be repaired immediately, the substation rebuilt, and the trust of German customers restored. The management of the Paris headquarters offered a premium of $25,000 to anyone who solved the problem before the set deadline, which was less than half a year. Given the scale of the destruction and the need to practically rebuild the entire installation from scratch, this was an extremely tight schedule. Tesla and Szigeti accepted the challenge. For the next few months they worked almost without a break, designing, building, testing. Nikola deployed all his skills and creativity to meet the task. And they succeeded. The substation was completed a few days before the deadline, all systems functioned flawlessly, and the honor of Edison's firm was saved. Tesla waited impatiently for the promised reward. He imagined buying his mother a new house in Gospic, finally being able to afford his own laboratory, beginning to realize his visions. The reward, however, never came. The company management began shuttling him from one office to another. Every official claimed the matter was outside their competence. Weeks passed, and the promised money remained out of reach. In the end, Tesla understood he had been cheated. The promise of a bonus had been an empty word. No one had ever intended to pay it. For the young engineer who had put his whole heart and months of hard work into the project, it was a devastating experience. The humiliation over the Strasbourg bonus was a blow Tesla found hard to endure. In his diaries he later wrote that Antal Szigeti lived from payday to payday and had no savings. He himself had also managed to put aside almost nothing, despite months of hard work. Remaining in a firm that had treated him this way was unacceptable for a man with such a strong sense of his own dignity. Nikola began weighing his options. His first thought was Russia. The idea of going to Russia was not as exotic as it might have seemed. During his work at the Parisian Edison Company, Tesla had met many Russian engineers and scientists who were in France on training placements or on business. He had learned enough Russian from them to conduct technical conversations fluently. One of these Russians had written him a letter of recommendation to Professor Nikolai Lyubimov, a distinguished physicist at Moscow University known for his work on electricity. The prospect of working in a Russian scientific environment, though geographically distant, seemed quite feasible. Tesla had already begun preparations for the journey when his Parisian colleagues intervened. They argued that Russia was a backward country, that working conditions there were incomparably worse than in Western Europe, and that the real opportunities for an electrical engineer lay elsewhere. Where? In America, of course, with Thomas Edison himself, not in some European branch, but at the New York headquarters, where everything that mattered in the world of electricity was happening. For the young inventor who had admired Edison for years as a model to emulate, this argument proved decisive. On June 6, 1884, Nikola Tesla stood on the dock of the New York harbor. The Atlantic crossing had been a nightmare. Even before boarding, he had been robbed, losing most of his luggage and nearly all his money. During the voyage, which lasted more than 2 weeks, he ate practically nothing because he could not afford it. He stepped off the steamship emaciated, dirty, and exhausted, with all his possessions fitting into one small suitcase. In that suitcase were things that for Tesla were more precious than any money. Above all, a volume of his own poetry, written in his youth. There were also technical articles of his authorship and detailed calculations for the design of a flying machine on which he had been working in his spare moments. And in his pocket he had the equivalent of 4 American cents. With all of this, he disembarked in New York, the city that was to become the stage of his greatest triumphs and deepest failures. The day after his arrival, Tesla appeared at Thomas Edison's office at Pearl Street in Lower Manhattan. He had with him a letter of recommendation from one of the European managers of the company, who knew of his achievements in Strasbourg. Edison received him in person, which was in itself extraordinary, given how many people sought audiences with the most powerful inventor in America each day. The meeting of these two men was a collision of two worlds. Edison was then 37, and at the peak of his fame. He was the man who had literally illuminated America, inventor of the electric light bulb, creator of the first power station, builder of an industrial empire worth millions of dollars. He had no formal education, barely a few months of primary schooling. All his knowledge he had acquired independently, through years of painstaking experiments. His working method was based on trial and error, on testing thousands of variants until one of them worked. He used to say that genius was 1% inspiration and 99% sweat. Tesla was his opposite in almost every respect. 9 years younger, educated at European polytechnics, fluent in several languages, thinking in abstract and theoretical terms. His working method consisted of conducting experiments in his head, of visualizing machines so precisely that he could draw them in the finest details before he had ever touched a tool. For Edison, such a way of thinking was almost incomprehensible. How could one design a machine without building prototypes? How could one be sure something would work without thousands of tests? Despite these fundamental differences, Edison recognized talent in Tesla and hired him on the spot. The Serbian engineer was assigned to work on direct current systems, which were the foundation of the entire Edison empire. Nikola set to work with characteristic intensity, often working 20 hours a day, arousing the admiration and alarm of his colleagues. The first great opportunity presented itself soon after he started work. The steamer Oregon, a luxurious British ocean liner, lay in New York Harbor with its lighting out of order. 2 onboard generators had burned out simultaneously, plunging the vessel in darkness. This was not only a matter of prestige. The Oregon was one of the most elegant passenger ships of the time, but above all, a safety issue. Without lighting, there was a serious risk of fire from the candles and oil lamps passengers would have to use instead. For Edison's firm, the situation was critical. The Oregon's lighting was a showpiece of their technology, proof that electricity could function safely even at sea. Every day's delay in the ship's departure meant not only financial loss, but also a reputational catastrophe. Edison needed someone who could solve the problem immediately. Tesla volunteered. Nikola spent the entire night on the ship, working without interruption, analyzing the damaged generators, identifying the causes of the failure, designing solutions. At dawn the next day, both generators were functioning flawlessly. Oregon could sail as planned. Edison, who came himself to check the results of the work, was deeply impressed. For the first time, he looked at the young Serb with genuine respect. This success opened new opportunities for Tesla in the firm. Edison entrusted him with a task he himself considered crucial to the company's future: a thorough modernization of the direct current generators. The existing designs were inefficient, wasting too much energy and requiring constant maintenance. Edison wanted Tesla to redesign them from scratch, preserving the operating principle but eliminating all the defects. And in the event of success, he promised a bonus of $50,000, an astronomical sum for those times, equivalent to millions today. Tesla set to work with a determination no one had previously seen in the firm. He practically moved into the laboratory, leaving only for a few hours, sleep. Over the following months, he designed not one, not two, but 24 different types of improved generators. Each of them was significantly better than the previous designs, more efficient, more durable, easier to maintain. It was titanic work, far exceeding what Edison could have expected. When Tesla presented the results of his work, Edison was clearly pleased. The new generators met all requirements and exceeded expectations. Nikola, remembering the promised bonus, mentioned the $50,000. Edison's reaction passed into the history of technology as one of the most cynical moments in the relations between great inventors. The American laughed and said Tesla apparently did not yet understand American humor. There would be no $50,000. Instead, Edison offered a small raise in the weekly wage. For Tesla, it was the final moment. He had been cheated in Strasbourg. Now he was cheated in New York by the man he had considered his idol. The sense of betrayal was all the more painful because Nikola had genuinely admired Edison, had seen in him a model of diligence and determination. Now it turned out that his hero was an ordinary cheat, willing to exploit others, talents without scruple. Tesla did not hesitate for a moment. He handed in his notice and left Edison's firm in the spring of 1885. This decision, though driven by honor and a sense of justice, was from a practical standpoint madness. Tesla had no savings, no home, no safety net of any kind. He was in a foreign country where he was only beginning to build his reputation. Resigning from Edison's was a leap into the unknown, without any safety net. Yet Nikola never regretted it for a moment. He preferred poverty and uncertainty to working for a man who had betrayed him. Fate, however, had surprises in store, both good and bad. Tesla had already acquired a certain reputation in New York electrical circles. His work on Edison's generators had not gone unnoticed. Several American financiers had heard about the talented young engineer from Europe and were interested in collaboration. Two of them, Robert Lane and Benjamin Vail, contacted Tesla shortly after his departure from Edison's firm. The meeting was promising but also frustrating. Tesla tried to persuade the potential investors of his vision of alternating current motors, the same idea he had carried in his head since the Budapest illumination. Lane and Vail listened politely but showed no interest whatsoever. Alternating current was for them an abstraction, something impractical and risky. Instead, they proposed something entirely different, the development of a new type of arc lamp for street lighting. Such lamps were then much in demand, and any innovation in this area could bring quick profit. Tesla agreed, though the proposal was far from his true ambitions. He needed money, he needed stability. He also needed a platform from which he could realize his larger plans. Thus was born the Tesla Electric Light and Manufacturing Company. Nikola was a co-owner of the firm, on equal terms with Lane and Vail. It seemed that fortune had at last smiled on him. Collaboration with Lane and Vail started promisingly. Tesla threw himself into the design of arc lamps with characteristic energy. The arc lamps of the time had a serious defect. During operation, they emitted an unpleasant sound, somewhere between a whistle and a hiss, that irritated the residents of illuminated streets. Nikola resolved to solve this problem. After several months of intensive work, he created an arc lamp that operated almost silently. The invention achieved commercial success, orders began to come in, the company started to generate income. Tesla was convinced this was only the beginning. He planned to use the profits from the lamps to finance his real projects, to build prototypes of alternating current motors. Lane and Vail, however, had entirely different plans. When the firm started to prosper, the partners decided to rid themselves of their brilliant but troublesome partner. They exploited the fact that Tesla had never paid attention to legal formalities, that he signed documents almost without reading them, trusting his partners. One day, Nikola learned that he had been expelled from his own company. Lane and Vail had conducted a legal operation that stripped him of all his shares in the enterprise he had created. As compensation, he received a package of shares in a newly formed company. The problem was that the firm was young and unknown. so these shares were practically worthless. They could be sold for a pittance or kept as a souvenir of yet another failure. In the autumn of 1886, Nikola Tesla found himself in a worse situation than ever before. He had no job, no money, not even a roof over his head. The man who had only recently been designing generators for the most powerful electrical company in the world now slept in homeless shelters on New York's Lower East Side. Sometimes he could not even afford a place on a bunk. Then he slept on the floor, with a suitcase full of his notes and diagrams under his head. In the most bleak period of his life, Tesla was forced to take on physical labor. The irony of fate arranged that he dug ditches for a company laying electric cables. That firm worked, among others, for Edison's company, the same Edison who had cheated and dismissed him. The great inventor, the visionary who carried in his head designs capable of changing the world, stood knee-deep in mud doing the hardest work for a few cents a day. This ordeal lasted through the winter and into early spring. Tesla later recalled this period as a time of trial that hardened him for life. He learned that a fall could be deep, but a strong man can rise again. He also learned something about people, that betrayal can come from those one trusts, and that one cannot rely on anyone but oneself. The change in fortune came from the most unexpected direction. The foreman of the crew in which Tesla worked was a man named Brown. His life story in some ways resembled Nikola's. Brown in his youth had dreamed of a scientific career, had wanted to study, had wanted to engage in research. Circumstances had forced him, however, into manual labor, into abandoning his ambitions and accepting his lot as a working man. Perhaps that was why he saw in Tesla something more than an ordinary ditch digger. One day, during a lunch break, Tesla told the foreman about his ideas. He spoke of alternating current, of the rotating magnetic field, of motors without commutators. Brown listened with growing astonishment. He did not understand the technical details, but he could sense that he was hearing something important, something beyond his own comprehension. He decided to help. Brown had a brother named Alfred, who worked as an engineer at the prestigious Western Union telegraph firm. This company was one of the giants of American industry, controlling most telegraphic communication on the continent. Alfred Brown, unlike his brother, had a technical education and could assess the value of Tesla's ideas. A meeting was arranged. Alfred Brown listened to Tesla with growing enthusiasm. Unlike Lane and Vail, who were interested only in quick profit, Brown understood the revolutionary potential of alternating current. He saw that the young Serb had in his head something that could change the face of industry. He decided to take the risk. Together with Brown, Tesla found another investor, a New York lawyer and businessman. The three of them decided to found a new company. In April 1887, the Tesla Electric Company laboratory opened on Fifth Avenue in New York. The location was symbolic, only a few blocks from Edison's workshop. Tesla, who only a few months earlier had been digging ditches, now had his own laboratory in the heart of Manhattan. Many years later, he wrote in his journal that at every visit to church he lit candles for the souls of those dearest to him, his father, mother, brother, sisters, Antal Szigeti, and Alfred Brown. The last named, the man who had pulled him out of the mud, held a place in his heart equal to family. The lessons of the past had not been wasted. This time, Tesla did not sign any documents without reading them carefully. He engaged competent lawyers who watched over every agreement, every contract, every clause, and above all, over patents. The patent system in the United States at the time was full of loopholes and abuses. Theft of inventions was an almost universal practice. The mechanism of fraud was simple and effective. Near patent offices there operated informally so-called badgers, engineers who made a business of copying promising inventions. When someone filed a patent application for something potentially valuable, a badger would quickly create a copy with minor modifications and register it first. The only protection against such practices was to have one's own person in the patent office who would ensure that the genuine patent was registered before the copy. Tesla and his partners arranged for such protection. In November and December 1887, Tesla filed applications for 7 patents covering polyphase alternating current motors and energy transmission systems. The package encompassed complete technology: generators, transformers, transmission lines, motors, lighting. The ideas were so original and so precisely worked out that the patents were issued quickly and without objection. Experts later assessed them as the most valuable patents in the field of electricity since the invention of the telephone. In May 1888, Tesla received an invitation that was to change his life. Thomas Martin, president of the American Institute of Electrical Engineers, asked him to deliver a lecture on alternating current motors and transformers. It was a prestigious forum, a gathering of the most important people in the electrical industry. Appearing before such an audience meant entering the elite of American science and technology. Tesla prepared carefully. He showed the same diagram that 6 years earlier he had drawn with a stick in the sand of the Budapest park, but now enriched by years of thought, calculation, and improvement. He demonstrated the rotating magnetic field in action, explained the principles of polyphase energy transmission, and presented models of his motors. The audience was impressed. After the lecture, everyone who counted in the world of American electricity knew Tesla's name. 2 months later, in July 1888, a man appeared in Tesla's office, whose visit was to set in motion one of the greatest conflicts in the history of industry. George Westinghouse was a figure no less imposing than Edison himself. The son of a simple blacksmith who had been interested in mechanics since childhood, he began inventing at the age of 15. His greatest achievement was the pneumatic brake for trains, patented in 1873. The invention revolutionized rail transport and made Westinghouse a very wealthy man. Westinghouse had long been interested in alternating current. He saw in it the future of electrical power, understood its superiority over Edison's direct current. The problem was that he lacked the key technology, an efficient electric motor. Tesla's patents solved that problem. Westinghouse came to the New York laboratory with a concrete purchase offer. Negotiations were brief. Westinghouse proposed $60,000 for the patent package, an enormous sum for those times. But that was not all. He also agreed to pay Tesla $2.50 for every horsepower of capacity installed in the machines sold by his firm. At the planned scale of production, this meant that Tesla should become a dollar millionaire within a few years. The agreement was signed. Nikola Tesla and George Westinghouse shook hands, not yet knowing that they had just begun a war that would go down in history as the War of Currents. On one side stood Edison with his direct current system, supported by the most powerful financiers in America, with John Pierpont Morgan at the head. On the other stood Westinghouse, with Tesla's alternating current. The stake was the industrial future of the United States, and perhaps of the whole world. Edison had no intention of yielding ground without a fight. He launched a wide-scale propaganda campaign against alternating current. His main argument was safety, or rather, its absence. Alternating current is deadly dangerous, proclaimed materials distributed by Edison's firm. Alternating current kills, warned posters, and leaflets. Edison organized public demonstrations at which animals were electrocuted with alternating current to prove its lethal power. The culmination of this campaign was an event that shocked public opinion throughout the country. On August 6, 1890, in the state prison at Auburn in the state of New York, the first execution by electric chair in history was carried out. The condemned man, William Kemmler, was killed by current supplied by a Westinghouse generator. Professor Harold Brown, who had constructed the chair, acquired this generator illegally, after Westinghouse had categorically refused to cooperate with the project. The press described the execution as a spectacle more terrible than hanging. The procedure did not go smoothly, the condemned man did not die from the first shock, and it was necessary to repeat the procedure. Newspapers were full of macabre details. For a time, a new verb even appeared in English, derived from Westinghouse's name, meaning death by electric shock. Many historians believe Edison was behind the entire operation. that he financed Professor Brown's experiments, and that it was he who summoned journalists to the execution. Edison's propaganda campaign filled Tesla with indignation, but did not discourage him from continuing his work. Shortly after signing the agreement with Westinghouse, Nikola moved to Pittsburgh, where the main headquarters of his new partner's firm was located. There, in modern laboratories, he could at last realize the projects he had dreamed of for years. In addition to perfecting alternating current motors, he engaged in research into phenomena that were decades ahead of his era. In the Pittsburgh laboratories, Tesla experimented with penetrating radiation, which a few years later would be described in detail by the German physicist Wilhelm Röntgen. Investigating the luminescence of vacuum tubes, Nikola discovered that, in addition to visible light, there were two other types of radiation. One of them was invisible to the human eye but caused the fluorescence of certain substances. The other had the capacity to penetrate matter, opaque to ordinary light. We know today that Tesla had discovered ultraviolet and X-ray radiation, though he himself did not realize the full significance of his observations. He also conducted parallel experiments on the effect of alternating current on the human body. He tested various frequencies and intensities, using himself as the experimental subject. His faithful friend Antal Szigeti, who had come to America after Tesla and now worked in his team, often accompanied him in these experiments. On one occasion, a younger engineer asked Antal what the essence of these experiments actually consisted of. The Hungarian, known for his sense of humor and reputation as a ladies' man, answered as a joke that alternating current at the right frequency had a beneficial effect on male potency. The joke quickly spread among the laboratory staff and reached Westinghouse himself. The financier, intrigued by the potential new application of his technology, came personally to Tesla with questions. Nikola had no idea what this was about, and listened with astonishment as Westinghouse explained. When the matter was cleared up, both men burst out laughing. Westinghouse was sufficiently curious, however, that one night he came secretly to the laboratory to test the effect of the current on his own body. Fortunately, it ended only in a mild shock, with no more serious consequences. Work in Pittsburgh had its dark side, however. Tesla, as the boss's protégé, was treated by the local engineers with reserve, and frequently with outright hostility. His special position, access to unlimited resources, direct contact with Westinghouse, all of this aroused envy and resentment. In addition, Nikola had to attend endless banquets and receptions at which Westinghouse was building business relationships. For someone as introverted as Tesla, these social obligations were a genuine torment. The situation reminded him of his student days in Graz, when he had to endure the hostility of his classmates and felt alienated from his surroundings. In the end, he decided to return to New York. In his notes, he later wrote that he came back with the feeling of a man leaving prison. The Westinghouse engineers had managed to drive him away, though not immediately. He resolved that henceforth he would work alone, or with a few hand-picked collaborators. There remained the matter of the contract with Westinghouse, which provided for a royalty of $2.50 per horsepower. As the company grew and orders flowed in, the sums owed to Tesla became astronomical. Westinghouse faced a dilemma. On the one hand, he was a man of honor and did not want to cheat his partner. On the other, paying out such gigantic sums risked destabilizing the financial foundation of the entire enterprise. Westinghouse decided to put the matter openly. He came to Tesla and frankly presented the situation. He explained that continuing to pay royalties according to the contract could drive the firm into bankruptcy. He asked Nikola to dissolve the agreement, to waive the money owed to him. This was an extraordinary request, given that millions of dollars were at stake. Tesla, however, did not hesitate for a moment. He took the contract, tore it to pieces, and threw it in the bin. For a man who had been cheated by business partners time and again, such a gesture required enormous trust. Tesla trusted Westinghouse and believed that the common cause was more important than personal wealth. This decision, though noble, had consequences that weighed on the inventor's entire later life. Had Tesla kept the contract, he would have become one of the wealthiest men in America. He would have had the resources to realize all his projects, to build laboratories, to employ an army of assistants. Instead, he remained a man of moderate income, dependent on the goodwill of investors and sponsors. He never, however, expressed regret for this decision. In 1893 came the moment that finally decided the War of Currents. Chicago was staging the world's Columbian Exposition, commemorating the 400th anniversary of Columbus's discovery of America. It was to be the largest exhibition in history, a presentation of the power and modernity of the United States before the entire world. The key element of the exhibition was electric lighting, which was to transform the exposition grounds into a city of the future. Two firms competed for the contract to light the exhibition: Edison General Electric and Westinghouse Electric. The stakes were enormous, not only financially but above all in terms of prestige. Whoever illuminated the Columbian Exposition would demonstrate the superiority of their technology before the eyes of millions of visitors. Edison was confident of victory. His firm was larger, better known, with stronger political backing. Westinghouse, however, submitted a significantly more competitive offer, exploiting the efficiency of alternating current. The organizers' decision was a blow to Edison. The contract for the exhibition's illumination went to Westinghouse. The order was for nearly 200,000 light bulbs, a number inconceivable by the standards of the time. Tesla and his team faced the task of designing a complete power supply system for this gigantic installation. In the machinery hall, 12 powerful alternating current generators were installed, the largest ever built. On May 1, 1893, President Grover Cleveland pressed a button, activating the exhibition's lighting. In an instant, thousands of lamps blazed into life, transforming the Chicago Exposition grounds into a place of almost magical beauty. Visitors accustomed to the half-darkness of gas-lit streets could not believe their eyes. Before them stretched a city of light, a vision of the future in which electricity would transform human life. In the Great Hall of Electricity, Tesla's polyphase system for generating and transmitting alternating current was proudly displayed. Visitors could see generators, transformers, and motors in operation. They could understand, at least in outline, the principles of this revolutionary technology. For the 27 million people who visited the exhibition during its several months of operation, it became clear that alternating current was the energy of the future. From that moment, more than 80% of all orders for electrical equipment in the United States concerned alternating current systems. Victory in Chicago opened the way to an even greater project. For decades, Americans had dreamed of harnessing the energy of Niagara Falls. These gigantic cascades of water, falling from a height of more than 50 meters, represented an energy potential capable of powering entire cities. The first attempt to use this force dated to 1725, when a simple water-powered sawmill had been built there. Since then, successive engineers had tried to devise an effective system, but all plans had foundered on the limitations of contemporary technology. Tesla had dreamed of Niagara since childhood. As a boy in distant Smiljan, he had seen pictures of the mighty falls and imagined how their power could be harnessed. Now, 40 years later, his dream was to come true. At the end of 1893, Westinghouse's firm received the contract to build a hydroelectric power station at Niagara Falls. The project was ambitious and risky, requiring enormous financial outlays and years of construction work. Among the investors were the wealthiest people in America and Europe. John Pierpont Morgan, though he had previously supported Edison, invested in Niagara. Alongside him appeared the Rothschilds and the Vanderbilts, names that symbolized the greatest fortunes of the age. Tesla had not a moment's doubt about the success of the enterprise. His faith was so strong that it infected even the most skeptical investors with optimism. Construction lasted 3 years and was a heroic undertaking. Workers labored in extreme conditions, drilling tunnels through rock, installing gigantic turbines, laying kilometers of cables. There were fatal accidents, there were incidents, there were moments when the entire project hung by a thread. For investors, it was a hell of uncertainty, a constant fear of whether the millions invested would ever be returned. At midnight on November 16, 1896, a historic moment arrived. Electrical energy generated at Niagara Falls flowed through cables to the city of Buffalo, more than 30 kilometers away. It was the first instance of energy transmission over such a great distance. In the years that followed, the number of generators grew to 10, and transmission lines reached as far as New York. Broadway blazed with lights powered by energy from Niagara. Overground electric railways, the subway, tramways, all of these operated on current generated hundreds of kilometers away. Even Edison systems were eventually converted to alternating current. In the midst of this dizzying success, Tesla experienced two deep personal losses. In 1892, his mother Juka died. Nikola managed to come home to bid farewell to the woman who had given him life and the talent to create. Not long afterwards, Antal Szigeti passed away, the only true friend Tesla had throughout his life. This modest Hungarian, who had never taken part in tormenting the young student in Graz, who had been present during the Budapest illumination, who had followed Tesla to America, did not live to see the full triumph of alternating current. His death left a void in Tesla's life that nothing could fill. As early as 1891, a few years before the triumph in Chicago and at Niagara, Tesla had patented a device that was to bring him a peculiar fame extending far beyond scientific circles. The Tesla coil, as the invention was called, was a transformer capable of generating extremely high voltages. During demonstrations, lightning bolts several meters long shot from its terminals, illuminating the laboratory like a scene from a Gothic novel. To the ordinary observer, it looked like magic, like power over the very forces of nature. The coil had, however, a significance extending far beyond visual effects. Tesla discovered that by means of it he could transmit electrical energy without wires. In November 1890, he succeeded in wirelessly illuminating a vacuum lamp, transmitting energy through air over a distance of several meters. It was a breakthrough moment, the beginning of an obsession that was to consume the next decades of his life. Tesla understood that if energy could be sent a few meters, it could be sent a few kilometers, and then hundreds and thousands. He imagined a world in which electric wires would become unnecessary, in which energy would flow through the atmosphere to every corner of the planet. Experiments with wireless energy transmission required ever greater power and ever more advanced equipment. At the beginning of 1895, Tesla was ready to conduct an experiment on an unprecedented scale. He planned to send a radio signal over a distance of 50 miles to the town of West Point in the state of New York. Preparations had been underway for months. The equipment was almost ready. And then catastrophe struck. On March 13, 1895, in the early morning, fire broke out in Tesla's laboratory on Fifth Avenue. The blaze spread with lightning speed, consuming everything in its path. Before the fire brigade could bring the blaze under control, the laboratory had ceased to exist. All the equipment burned, all the prototypes, all the material prepared for the great experiment. Also destroyed was Tesla's personal archive. Documents accumulated over years, including letters from his mother and sisters, the only tangible mementos of his family. Tesla was convinced the fire had not been accidental. In his notes, he expressed certainty that the laboratory had been set alight on German orders. A few years earlier, he had refused to cooperate with Werner von Siemens and the German government, despite pressure that had lasted almost a year. He believed this refusal had not been forgiven him. Many contemporaries suspected Edison, whose motive seemed more obvious. The truth never came to light, and the fire remained one of the many mysteries surrounding the inventor's life. The destruction of the laboratory was a devastating blow. But even more painful were the scientific consequences. A year after the fire, the Italian inventor Guglielmo Marconi obtained a patent for wireless telegraphy. Tesla had been working on similar technology for years, but had lost all evidence of his priority in the flames of the March fire. In 1909, Marconi received the Nobel Prize for his contribution to the development of wireless communication. For Tesla, this was a double affront. Not only had the credit owed to a pioneer been taken from him, but someone else had been honored for it. For the rest of his life, he fought a patent battle against Marconi, which he ultimately did not manage to win while alive. The history of invention knows, however, an even more dramatic episode connected with the Tesla-Edison rivalry. In September 1890, still before the fire and the dispute with Marconi, Nikola was walking in Central Park in New York. According to an account contained in his personal diaries, some invisible force caused him to sit down on a bench. At that moment, he heard rapidly retreating footsteps. A moment later, he noticed that something glinting was embedded in the trunk of a maple tree opposite him, roughly at eye level. On closer inspection, he recognized it as a revolver bullet. Someone had just tried to kill him. Tesla immediately notified Westinghouse, who hired a private detective. After a week and a half of investigation, the detective found the suspect, a 30-year-old Irishman with a criminal record. On condition that the matter not go to court, the man agreed to testify. He said he had been hired by Thomas Edison for $200 to kill Tesla. Is this story true? It is impossible to verify today. On one hand, it is hard to imagine that Tesla would fabricate such a serious accusation in private notes, intended only for himself. On the other, contemporaries knew him as a man prone to exaggeration and dramatization. Edison was never accused or questioned in the matter. If the assassination attempt did in fact take place, however, it casts an entirely new light on the War of Currents and on the man whom America reveres as one of the greatest inventors in its history. The 1890s were for Tesla a period of both triumphs and growing isolation. His laboratories were visited by the most influential people in America, and newspapers wrote regularly about his work. Nikola was a tall, dark-haired, elegantly dressed man with aristocratic manners. He spoke several languages, was knowledgeable in literature and art, and could hold brilliant conversations. He had everything that could attract the attention of women: fame, money, looks, intelligence. And yet he was never seen in the company of any woman. Rumors about Tesla's private life circulated incessantly. People speculated about hidden homosexuality, mysterious love affairs, some tragic romance from the past. The truth, recorded in the inventor's diaries, was far simpler and more melancholy. After the severe cholera he had survived at 18, women ceased to interest him physically. He remained a virgin to the end of his life, and, as he himself wrote, considered this advantageous in his case. All his energy could be directed to work, without being distracted by feelings and passions. In 1898, Tesla presented the world with an invention that was decades ahead of its time. At an electrical exhibition in the newly built Madison Square Garden, he showed the world's first radio-controlled boat. It was a small vessel with an iron hull that moved about in a specially constructed basin, executing commands transmitted without any wires. Tesla could make the boat move in any direction: stop, accelerate, change course, all of this by means of radio signals. The audience was astonished, but few took the demonstration seriously. The concept of wirelessly controlling machines seemed so fantastic that most viewers considered the demonstration a clever trick. Rumors spread that Tesla had not invented anything at all, that a hidden dwarf sat inside the boat steering it from within. Others maintained it was simply an illusion, some kind of magic trick. The idea of transmitting commands over a distance without a visible connection was simply too revolutionary for people at the end of the 19th century. At this same exhibition, Tesla personally met Guglielmo Marconi for the first time. Relations between the inventors were cool from the very start. Both knew they were competing for the claim of priority in the field of wireless communication. Both also knew that a confrontation was inevitable. Marconi had, however, something that Tesla lacked: a powerful patron. Behind the Italian stood Andrew Carnegie, one of the wealthiest men in American history, whose fortune no previous sponsor of Tesla's could match. The patent war between Tesla and Marconi dragged on for years. In 1905 came a moment that Tesla experienced as the ultimate betrayal. The American Patent Office invalidated patents previously granted to Tesla and awarded priority to Marconi. This decision appeared to be based more on political and financial influence than on merit. Tesla wanted to fight, wanted to appeal to the courts, but he lacked the money for it. The costs of a patent lawsuit exceeded his financial means, and no investor was willing to finance a war against Carnegie. The turn of the 19th and 20th centuries brought Tesla increasing material difficulties. He still received certain royalty payments from his polyphase patents, but these incomes were barely enough for day-to-day expenses. Running a modern laboratory, financing ambitious experiments, this was out of the question. The man who a few years earlier could have become one of the wealthiest people in America had he not torn up his contract with Westinghouse, was now barely making ends meet. In this situation came a proposal that seemed like salvation. Leonard Curtis, one of Tesla's recruiters working at the Colorado Springs Electric Company, offered him access to laboratories in the Colorado mountains. Curtis promised to provide everything Tesla needed: land for a research installation, unlimited quantities of electricity, technical and logistical assistance. For an inventor who dreamed of large-scale energy transmission experiments, it was an irresistible offer. In May 1899, Nikola Tesla set out for Colorado to begin the strangest and most controversial chapter of his scientific career. Colorado Springs was a remarkable place, perfectly suited to the experiments Tesla had dreamed of. Located at nearly 2,000 meters above sea level, at the foot of the majestic Rocky Mountain peaks, it was famous for intense thunderstorm activity. Lightning struck here more frequently, and with greater force, than in most other places on the continent. For a man who wanted to study atmospheric electricity and experiment with energy transmission over great distances, it would have been hard to imagine a better location. In May 1899, Tesla with a few collaborators arrived in the mountain town and immediately set to work. On the prairie outside the town, far from buildings, there arose a structure that must have astonished the local inhabitants. A wooden construction of bizarre shapes, with a tall mast jutting skyward, looked like something transported from a science fiction novel. Inside was a laboratory equipped with the most advanced apparatus Tesla had been able to assemble, including a gigantic oscillator, also called a magnifying transmitter. The oscillator was the heart of the entire installation. This powerful transformer could generate voltages of millions of volts and frequencies, reaching hundreds of thousands of hertz. During operation, it produced artificial lightning bolts more than 40 meters long, far more powerful than natural electrical discharges. Local inhabitants could observe these phenomena from a distance and speculate about what the eccentric scientist was actually doing in his mysterious workshop. The main purpose of the experiments in Colorado was to test a hypothesis Tesla had been working on for years. He was convinced that the Earth, as a planet, possesses its own electrical charge of enormous potential. If so, then there exists some natural mechanism sustaining this charge, and by disturbing it in the appropriate way, it would be possible to induce a resonance encompassing the entire planet. Such a resonance would make it possible to transmit electrical energy over any distance without wires. Any point on Earth could draw energy from such a global system. The experiments lasted for 9 months, from May 1899 to January 1900. Tesla worked with his characteristic intensity, often through entire nights, observing storms, measuring the parameters of atmospheric discharges, and testing his devices. The results confirmed his assumptions. The Earth does indeed behave like a gigantic electrical capacitor, and disturbing it at one point can produce measurable effects at other, distant points. One night, during particularly intensive experiments, Tesla had an experience that shook him to the core. Observing signals received by his sensitive instruments, he noticed regular pulses that did not fit any known atmospheric phenomena. They repeated at equal intervals, as if someone were transmitting an encoded message. Tesla concluded that he was receiving signals from space, possibly from some extraterrestrial intelligence inhabiting another planet. When he announced this discovery publicly, the reaction was unambiguous. He was considered mad. The scientific community ridiculed his claims, newspapers printed caricatures, and even former allies began to distance themselves from the eccentric inventor. From the perspective of today's knowledge, we cannot exclude the possibility that Tesla was the first person in history to register radio waves originating from space. Such signals, emitted by various celestial bodies, were later confirmed by radio astronomy. Tesla may have been a pioneer of a field that only officially came into being several decades later. In January 1900, the Colorado experiments came to an end. Tesla left the mountain laboratory with empty pockets, but a head full of plans. He was now absolutely convinced that the creation of a global wireless energy transmission system was possible. He needed only the appropriate means to build a full-scale installation. Returning to New York, he took with him detailed notes, photographs, and measurements. These materials were to serve to convince investors of the feasibility of his vision. Presentations of the Colorado experiment results produced mixed reactions. Photographs of artificial lightning shooting from Tesla's machines looked spectacular, but also terrifying. To the average observer, all of this looked like the work of a madman, perhaps even a dangerous one. One man, however, listened to Tesla's explanations with growing interest. This was John Pierpont Morgan, the most powerful financier in America, a man whose wealth and influence surpassed the resources of many a state. Morgan received Tesla in his office and listened to the presentation from beginning to end. He was impressed by the vision, though he did not fully understand the technical details. One question gave him no peace. How could one earn from energy transmitted wirelessly? Who would pay for electricity that anyone could simply draw from the air, and how? Tesla had no convincing answer to this question. His vision was a scientist's vision, not a businessman's. He saw a world in which energy was available to all, without wondering about business models. Despite these doubts, Morgan decided to invest. He granted Tesla $150,000 to build a station for wireless energy transmission and a global radio communication system. The year 1900 was already upon them. The new century was beginning. Tesla found a plot of land for construction in Suffolk County on Long Island, about 100 kilometers from Manhattan. The location was ideal. Remote, away from the electrical interference of the great city, yet close enough to maintain contact with investors and suppliers. The project that took shape there surpassed everything Tesla had previously created. He envisaged a research complex in which hundreds, perhaps thousands of people would work. The central element was to be a tower approximately 47 meters tall, topped with a gigantic copper dome, 30 meters in diameter. This structure was to serve as a transmitter and receiver of energy, connecting with similar stations throughout the world. Tesla planned a network covering all continents, a system that would revolutionize human civilization. Construction began in 1901. The tower rose quickly, attracting the attention of local residents and journalists. Tesla named his creation Wardenclyffe Tower, after a nearby estate. When in 1902 the structure was nearly complete, the inventor published a brochure describing the capabilities of his world system. Among the applications listed were connecting all telegraph stations in the world, instant transmission of press news to all continents, the creation of a global communications system enabling contact with any point on Earth, and wireless transmission of energy to homes, factories, and means of transport. Reading this list, it is hard to resist the impression that Tesla was describing the Internet, the mobile telephone, and wireless device charging more than 100 years before their creation. His vision was prophetic, but it was so far ahead of the technological capabilities and social readiness of his era that it was bound to end in failure. In September 1902, Morgan halted further funding for the project. The tower stood complete, its copper dome gleaming in the sun, but without money for further work it was useless. Tesla tried to persuade Morgan to continue the investment, wrote letters, asked for meetings, but the financier remained unmoved. Attempts to find other sponsors likewise came to nothing. No one wanted to invest in a project whose economic rationale was so unclear. The year 1903 brought Tesla a breakdown. The greatest work of his life, the project to which he had devoted all his strength and all his faith, was falling apart before his eyes. Wardenclyffe Tower stood empty and deserted, a monumental memorial to unfulfilled dreams. Tesla tried to salvage the situation by concentrating on other projects. He worked on turbines of a new design, smaller and more efficient than those currently in use, which might bring in the income needed to complete the world system. But these plans, too, never came to fruition. Wardenclyffe Tower stood for the next several years, falling into ever greater ruin. In 1917, in the midst of the First World War, the military authorities declared it a potential threat. There was concern that the tall metal structure could serve as a landmark for German airships, which might theoretically reach the American coast and bomb New York. On the military's orders, the tower was demolished with dynamite. Associated with Wardenclyffe Tower is one of the most intriguing conspiracy theories surrounding Tesla. On June 30, 1908, in Russia, on the territory of eastern Siberia, a powerful explosion of unknown cause occurred. The so-called Tunguska meteorite, though no meteorite was ever found, caused devastation over an area of 2,000 square kilometers. Trees were knocked down within a radius of tens of kilometers from the epicenter. The shock waves circled the entire planet. To this day, there is no certainty as to what caused the catastrophe. Some conspiracy enthusiasts claim that Tesla and his experiments with Wardenclyffe Tower were responsible. According to this version, the inventor had succeeded in transmitting a massive charge of energy through the atmosphere, which fell on the uninhabited territory of Siberia. Evidence for this, supposedly, consists of his borrowings of Siberian maps from New York libraries, allegedly made by Tesla just before the event. Of course, there is no evidence confirming this theory, and most scientists consider it absurd. The fact remains, however, that Tesla did claim his technology made it possible to transmit energy over any distance, and with any power. In 1915, the newspaper New York Times reported that Nikola Tesla and Thomas Edison were jointly to receive the Nobel Prize in Physics. This news caused a sensation in the scientific world. The two great rivals, whose conflict had shaped the history of electricity, were to be honored together for their achievements. Tesla, however, refused to accept the prize. He was not prepared to share this distinction with the man who had cheated him out of $50,000, who had conducted a ruthless propaganda campaign against him, and who, if one is to believe his diaries, had hired someone to kill him. No money, not even that associated with the world's most prestigious scientific prize, was worth such humiliation. After the failure of the Wardenclyffe project and his refusal of the Nobel Prize, Tesla withdrew more and more from the world. His behavior became increasingly eccentric, increasingly difficult for those around him to understand. He began counting his steps while walking, obsessively ensuring that their number was divisible by 3. At every meal in a restaurant, he required exactly 18 napkins on the table. Not one more, not one fewer. An obsession with cleanliness developed in him that went far beyond ordinary fastidiousness. The numbers 3, 6, and 9 took on mystical significance for him. He saw in them the key to understanding the universe. He spent more and more time in New York's parks feeding pigeons. This activity, initially casual, turned into a genuine obsession. Tesla rescued injured and sick birds, took them to his hotel room, nursed and fed them on a specially prepared grain mixture. On one occasion, he asked the cook at the Hotel New Yorker to prepare a particular recipe for his charges, hoping he could patent it and sell it at a profit. For a man who had once designed systems capable of changing the face of civilization, this was depressingly trivial work. At the same time, however, Tesla did not stop working. His mind, though increasingly marked by peculiarities and obsessions, continued to generate ideas ahead of their time. On July 11, 1934, the front page of the New York Times carried an article under the sensational headline, "Tesla, at 78, announces new death beam." The inventor claimed he had developed a weapon capable of sending concentrated beams of particles with sufficient energy to shoot down enemy aircraft at a range of 250 miles. Tesla described his death ray as a weapon that would make war impossible. He argued that if every country possessed such technology, an invisible wall would be created, protecting the borders of every state. No aggressor would dare to attack, knowing that its forces would be destroyed before they reached their target. It was a vision of mutually assured deterrence, similar to that which, half a century later, would accompany the nuclear age. The scientific world treated these announcements with reserve, and many regarded them as proof of the advancing madness of the aging inventor. Despite the skepticism of official scientific circles, Tesla's ideas attracted the attention of intelligence services of various countries. The Soviet Union showed particular interest. Tesla had always spoken of Soviet Russia with a certain sympathy, appreciating that its scientists took his ideas more seriously than Western colleagues. He repeatedly received invitations to move to Moscow, but always declined, explaining that at his age a move across the ocean made no sense. At some point, the exact date is not known, Tesla passed some of his documents and studies to a Soviet diplomat. According to various sources, he received for this a check for $25,000. These were mainly materials concerning the world system for wireless energy transmission, but the complete list of documents handed over remains unknown. In his later notes, Tesla wrote that he had been sharing his ideas with Soviet scientists for 20 years, adding, however, that in the Soviet Union his concepts were met with disbelief, as elsewhere. Tesla spent his last years in room 3327 of the Hotel New Yorker in Manhattan. He lived modestly, almost in poverty, subsisting on small royalty payments and occasional fees for articles. The man who could have become one of the wealthiest people in the world, who had designed the systems powering the whole of modern civilization, lived in one hotel room, surrounded by his pigeons and piles of notes. On January 1, 1943, Tesla made his last entry in his memoirs. He wrote that leaving this world, he looked back and told himself that something, though perhaps not much, had remained after him. That he was happy to have given something to humanity, that his life had not been in vain. These words, written in the trembling hand of an 86-year-old man, constitute the summary of a remarkable life, full of triumphs and tragedies, brilliant discoveries, and bitter disappointments. 6 days later, on January 7, 1943, Nikola Tesla was found dead in his hotel room. The official cause of death was coronary thrombosis. Beside his body lay a book of Serbian folk songs by Vuk Karadžić, collector of folklore and reformer of the Serbian literary language. To the last moment, Tesla had remained connected to his roots, to the culture of the small people from which he had come to change the world. Almost immediately after the inventor's death, rumors appeared about the mysterious circumstances of his passing. Some claimed he had been murdered by German spies who wanted to acquire his last studies. Others pointed to Soviet agents, still others to American special services. The reason for these speculations was what happened immediately after the body was discovered. Tesla's nephew, Sava Kosanović, hurried to the hotel the morning after receiving word of his uncle's death. When he arrived, the body had already been removed, but Kosanović immediately noticed that someone had searched through the deceased's belongings. Drawers were open, documents scattered, some objects visibly moved. Who had been in the dead inventor's room, and what were they looking for? That question has never received a clear answer. In September 2016, more than 70 years after Tesla's death, the American Federal Bureau of Investigation declassified documents relating to the case. The files contain numerous references to the death ray and to missing notes and documents. Some materials from Tesla's archive have never been found. The disappearance of these papers gave rise to another conspiracy theory, according to which Tesla's studies were stolen by German spies and used in the construction of secret Third Reich weapons, including the legendary flying saucers, also called spinning discs. All these theories, though fascinating, have no factual confirmation. What is a fact, however, is that a significant portion of the later work of one of the most brilliant and probably one of the most eccentric inventors of all time vanished under unexplained circumstances. What became of it we may never know. True global fame came to Tesla only after his death, when humanity had reached the level of development that allowed many of his ideas to be understood. Alternating current, which revolutionized industry, is so obvious today that few remember how fiercely it was fought at the outset. Wireless energy transmission, laughed at as fantasy, is becoming a reality in our own time. Radio control, dismissed as a conjurer's trick, today powers drones and autonomous vehicles. The vision of a global communications network, described in the brochure about the world system, was fulfilled in the form of the Internet. Tesla left behind not only concrete inventions and patents, he left behind a way of thinking that was ahead of his time by generations. He could imagine things that others could not even name. He paid for this capacity with the price of isolation, incomprehension, and in the end obscurity during his lifetime. Some of the enigmas he left to humanity still await resolution. Perhaps one day they will be solved, and then the full measure of Nikola Tesla's genius will become clear to all. A unit of magnetic flux density bears his name. The world's most famous electric car brand bears his name. Countless laboratories, institutes, and scientific prizes throughout the world bear his name. The boy born in a storm in a small village on the Austro-Hungarian border, who was supposed to be a child of darkness, turned out indeed to be a child of light, the one who illuminated the entire world. Thank you for your attention, and for this shared journey through the life of Nikola Tesla. If you enjoyed the material, I encourage you to leave a positive rating and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories about great figures who shaped our world.